In general, the common law answer to that, by common law, I mean the culmination of contract review and standards that's pretty well adapted, will say that the courts have the authority to look at non-competes. They're going to enforce them, but they have the authority to strike a balance between the needs of the marketplace, especially when we're talking about medical services, and the needs of the parties and the legitimate economic interests. So it's referred to tailoring the circumstances. So a non-compete may say that you cannot, for the next 2 years, practice any form of medicine within 150 miles of the primary office of the entity you just worked for. A court could determine that the need for OB services is high enough that they may tailor that geographic description. They may think the economic circumstances are so that the period of time is too onerous, and then adjust those. You can never count on the court adjusting anything. And the other thing that's really important to keep in mind about that is a topic not raised that often, is that these non-competes usually carry with them the right, the contract right that's been surrendered for the employer to go into the court and ask for a temporary restraining order without a hearing. They show the contract. They have a description of what their concern is, and the court will issue a temporary restraining order keeping you from working within the original contracted area, which means that gets served on you and you're forbidden to work. So whatever you had as an employment relationship post-employment is now stopped until the court holds some sort of hearing and determines whether or not they're going to modify this agreement. But in the meantime, you're underwater and you're in trouble. So negotiating those right off the bat and explaining. The other thing is when these things are triggered. Many contracts will, I think quite appropriately, say that the non-compete, it is not binding if the employer fires you, especially for no cause. And that's one of the most common things that Grow Midwives winds up recommending to people, is that if you have a non-compete, if they bring you in and then fire you because of just whatever it is, market forces or whatever else it is, it's much more appropriate and equitable to say, well, then I should be held by the non-compete. Because essentially the purpose of the non-compete is sort of a 1-2 punch in the sense of encouraging people to remain in employment when they sign on, and the other is so that they don't turn around, as the term says, and compete directly against you in the same marketplace. Well, if they've decided they don't want you to render services for them, it seems the equities go the other way, and that there ought to be an opportunity to be able to compete or at least find work that isn't necessarily competitive. When found pressured with a non-compete, you've already got one that's been signed and now you're working. Many employers, when they offer a deal, when they're terminating an employee for no cause, and one of those deals is to be released from that non-compete. So even if you have one, you could turn around and negotiate and say, I'll settle any claim I have against you in return for this release for this non-compete. The geographic area is something that's really important and is easily missed. If you're in a local major medical center and you think of it as the big building down the street, and yet you look at the terms of the non-compete and it says any of our locations, and then you figure out that St. Huset's Hospital has entities in one form or another about every 7 blocks around the whole metropolitan area. So when we look at non-competes, it's not uncommon at all to find that someone who's working under a non-compete is not going to be able to practice their chosen profession without picking up stakes and moving a fairly significant distance for that period of time for the non-compete. So you're just off for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is. That might be something you'd sign on to when you start fresh out of midwifery school, but it's certainly not something you would be happy to have agreed to when the kids are going to kindergarten, you've married, you have a spouse who has a career, etc. And so those things can be very destructive. Which circles back to the idea, if I up and quit on you, it's real fair for you to ask me not to compete against you. But if you up and quit on me, you certainly ought to be able to work in your chosen profession in your home community without suffering those kinds of consequences. But just imagine the pressure that somebody's under if they're faced with a non-compete and they're being asked to buy tail coverage too.